Okay, thank you. Thank you for joining me this evening. I have to say, the format of communication, this makes me really anxious, not only because it's the first big Zoom thing I've done, but because of those of you who've seen me lecture before, I normally stand up, walk around, channel the kind of ideas through my body with a few prompts up there behind for the slides. And it's a kind of quite a visceral experience, at least it is for me. And actually, students often do, I remember students at Kingston used to do kind of skits on me lecturing. So sort of sitting here looking at the screen is for me rather weird. I did have an idea that I'd wear 4 different hats just to keep you amused, but my friend Kate said they'd probably think that I completely lost it in quarantine, that I'd and actually that's all you'd remember, was Jeremy gave a lecture and he had 4 hats. I've also decided not to use any images, I'm afraid, so all you get is my face and our house behind, so you can get distracted by that. And I think that my anxiety about this is also kind of accentuated because I think the last thing in the world that we need at the moment is pronouncements and prescriptions, and yet all you've got is my face making pronouncements and prescriptions. And so the kind of power and authority of the image it might be a bit overwhelming. Anyway, I share my anxieties. That's what everyone's doing anyway on the screen. I'm just doing it with however many people, 174 people that many of whom I've never met before. So I've called this talk Architecture After Architecture, and this was the title of a research proposal that Tatiana Schneider and I put in January. So many of the ideas I developed with Tatiana, so I'd just like to acknowledge that. It was actually complete luck that my thing for the Architecture Foundation fell on Earth Day, but let's just say it was prescient. Because what I want to talk about is architecture's relationship to the climate emergency, and I'll also talk a bit about COVID. Let me just quickly summarize the argument then, and then I'll get into some stories. The underlying hypothesis is that the climate emergency presents a fundamental threat to some of the values on which the modern project of architecture has founded. And therefore, the response to the climate emergency will at the same time necessarily then move away from some of those fundamentals into new modes of thinking and production. And so the title of the lecture, Architecture After Architecture, is knowingly provocative because it suggests that architecture, as we know it, is no more, and that we need architecture. It's a bit easier if there was slides because architecture would be in italics, and then after architecture would not be in italics, so you'd see a kind of difference. And so at the most provocative, it says that architecture as it's presently formulated is at best fragile in the face of the climate emergency, at worst potentially redundant. I don't actually believe that fully, but I think it's worth just following through that as a set of speculations. But before doing that, as is my wont, for those of you who've read my stuff, I normally start with anecdotes because, I don't know, I just find it an easy way to get into arguments. And so I'd just tell 3 anecdotes, which when these come from, I forget which period, maybe December? No, November, I think. When I was just trying to, it was just when the brilliant Architects Climate Action Network was being formulated, and they asked me to do something with their launch. And so 3 anecdotes. The first is about this place, about our house, which we've just retrofitted to make it better for our older age, but also better in relation to the climate. And although the house, for those who know it, was seen when we built it as a kind of sustainable pioneer, at the time, airtightness just wasn't really on the agenda. Passive house was a strange German term, and we built a house with lots of complex junctions, and frankly, the airtightness was pretty crap. And so we had a very good set of environmental consultants come in Habit who did an air blur test. And Sarah and I kind of stood and sort of held our hands while air came through all the gaps. And so we spent a lot of time and a lot of money putting tape all around the building, and we've reduced the air tightness by about half. But what that in a way showed us is that I'm very happy we did it. I think it's made the building much more comfortable, but there's also something about sticky tape, it's really expensive sticky tape, being our kind of defense against the ravages of the climate emergency. So that's the first anecdote. About the same time, Steve Tompkins, somehow got all of the Sterling Prize winners to sign up to the climate emergency. And I think to declare climate emergency. And that was a sign, I thought, of a great solidarity and hope, actually. I thought that was good. Until about 3 weeks later, week by week, each of the people who had signed up announced a new airport project. So we had Grimshaw doing Heathrow under the terrible kind of wording that it's going to be carbon neutral, as if an airport could be carbon neutral. Depends what one's definition is, I suppose. So then we had Zaha Hadid, who actually didn't have so much hubris, but in her West Sydney airport, they just came up with some, stuff, quote, extensive use of daylight. Well, I hope so, because dark airports are fairly horrible. Natural ventilation, that's nice, thank you. And water recycling. So that's going to save the world as people fly over to Sydney. And then Forster, the week after, really raised the sustainability stakes by announcing a new airport for a resort in Saudi Arabia, which was going to be quote unquote eco-friendly. And so suddenly the kind of hubris of declaring climate emergency was revealed for what it was, which is hubris. The only good piece of news that came out of that is that just recently, as you know, probably know, the Heathrow has been declared illegal on environmental grounds. So that's the second anecdote. And the third is a lecture that I went to, I think Ellis was there, some of you might have been there as well, by Kenneth Frampton, the great architectural historian. And Ken started off the lecture with, as he does in critical regionalism, with a quite forthright critique of commodification, of global capitalism, and for the first time of the climate emergency. And I thought, this is good, this is great. Actually situating a lecture on architectural history within the crisis of capitalism, the crisis of commodification, the crisis of the climate emergency. But then what happened was that he did a very articulate lecture, because he's a very articulate man, in which he showed a certain canon of architecture, which he talks about in relation to Semper, in earthworks, in poetic tectonics, of response to culture and context. And at the end, he got all but a standing ovation. I think it probably didn't get it because half the audience were over 80 and probably wouldn't be able to have managed that. But there was a sense that his lecture was like a kind of warm bath in which the architectural community could convince itself that actually this strain, this canon of architecture that he was laying out is enough to in some way either resist, which I don't think it does, but certainly to escape from the challenges that we face. And so what these three small examples suggested to me is that there's a kind of conflicted nature of architecture's engagement with the climate emergency. First of all, the fragility of design, whether it's expensive tape or not, in relation to taping over much wider societal and economic cracks, i.e. the tools of design as we know them can't address the complexity of the issues. Secondly, the duplicity of phony words. And we really need to call those out, and there's good stuff being called out about that. But the phony words of, and I'll get to the word sustainability, the phony words of the hubris of the Sterling Prize architects. And thirdly, the retreat into a comfortable, internalized world of architectural values and architectural systems, which in that tend to allow us to turn our backs to the extent of the crisis. And running through all these is the term sustainability. And I suppose the problem with the word sustainability is actually in its, I don't know whether it's etymology, but in its very basic meaning, which is that it suggests we can sustain. It suggests that we can sustain our current modes of operation with a few technical fixes. It suggests that business can be normal. And yet, what's clear is that business cannot be normal. COVID has shown us that, and the climate emergency is showing us that. And what I think is most interesting is how the kind of business as normal model is so embedded within the modern project. And that is what we need to start to unpick, which is the modern project, and in particular, the value system of the modern project in terms of progress, in terms of growth. So it's not surprising that the kind of golden era of architecture was that of the modern project, because architecture was used as the handmaiden for those values of progress and growth. Not just the handmaiden, but as the kind of the exemplary project par excellence of how you manifest those things of progress and growth. In as much as you wrap up buildings in endless displays of new forms of aesthetics, of new forms of style, of new forms of materiality, of new techniques. And then as the end of the 20th century got closer and closer to its end, and 21st century, these kind of reiterations of progress in architecture got ever more hysterical. And it's not a question of the modern project versus the postmodern project. The postmodern project did exactly the same. It just wrapped up it spatialized capital in different garb. But effectively what was going on was a hysterical spatialization of late capitalism. And in that, architecture became the way by which a vehicle for the announcement of progress. So the question is, if those twin pillars of progress and growth are so fundamentally challenged by the parameters of the climate emergency, where does that leave architecture? Why didn't we call it out at an earlier stage? And I think that probably we didn't call it out because people were making too much money and because the stuff looked so attractive. So the production of buildings is absolutely embedded, I would argue, and lots of other people argue, in the production of the climate emergency. It is part of a kind of technocratic regime which is dependent on the carbon state, which is dependent on extraction, which is dependent on fossil fuels, still is, however much we talk about carbon neutrality. It's dependent on growing consumption, and it's dependent on the orthodoxies of neoliberal capitalism. And to say, therefore, that architecture is complicit in the climate emergency is not to blame anybody, it's just a statement of fact. And the standard response to that statement, i.e. that we are bound into the production of the climate emergency, the standard response is in some way to mitigate it through technical fixes, through BREEAM, through LEED, through Green Star in Australia, and so on and so forth, in which you suggest that the climate emergency can be solved. Now, of course, all architects in the production of new buildings or the retrofitting of old buildings should be striving as much as they can towards carbon neutrality. That's a given. But one of the things that I think happens is that the concentration on these technical fixes, on the technocratic regimes, actually shuts down other bits of our brains and other bits of our imagination, and therefore doesn't allow us to deal with the emergency in other, what I would say, are more productive ways. And therefore what we get is this sense of architecture as another form of kind of utopian techno-boosterism. We've got Bjarke Ingels' floating islands, we've got flowering cities in the deserts, we've got hydroponic facades, we've got all this kind of stuff in which these technical boosterish solutions are applied, I think, as a fairly thin veneer to the underlying problem. And that also aligns with a certain strand of techno-boostery ecology, like kind of spraying sulfate into the sky to reflect the sun, and all these sort of utopian technical solutions, which don't frankly have any technical credibility. If you put sulfate up into the sky, it just displaces the problem somewhere else, mainly into the global south. But in all of these, what one gets, whether it is the architectural techno-boostering or the ecological techno-boosters, repeats exactly the same mistake that created the climate emergency in the first place, which is man's dominion over nature, man's intervention in nature, and man's unfettered control over nature. And so all of these solutions, in one way or another, tend to actually magnify the problem rather than deal with it. And therefore, the avoidance of these kind of sense that there is a kind of a solution needs to be reconsidered. And the only way we can reconsider that is what Tatiana and I argued in our research proposal, is by looking at the other constitutions of the climate emergency, and most particularly its economic constitution. And so here, I still think the best book on climate emergency is Naomi Klein, because she's so articulate about the entrenched nature of the climate emergency in relation to capitalism, and the way that the machinations of capitalism have created the emergency. And if you then take the argument which I made before about architectures being enthralled to the machinations of late capitalism in the way that it spatializes it, then you can see that these two things are intertwined. That actually the production of the climate emergency and production of architecture are intertwined in the same location, which is that of late capitalism. And therefore what we need to do is to try to step away from the values and the inequities and the violence of late capitalism and look for other models. And so just to kind of get back to the main argument, which is to say that I think that the climate emergency forces the condition of architecture after architecture. It actually demands us to think of architecture after architecture. It demands us to look again at some of the assumptions and values upon which the architecture as a modern project have been founded. Now, I'm often accused of being negative, or that I don't like I don't like architecture. Sometimes I don't like architects either, but that's a personal thing. And this could be seen as another kind of sense of Jeremy being a kind of naysayer. I think that's what Paul Finch called me when yeah, definitely a naysayer, yeah. Because I didn't believe in sulfates being sprayed up into the air. Whereas actually I see it as rather different. I see this as actually a space in which new forms of architecture, spatial production will evolve, and with that, new forms of spatial intelligence will be deployed, and with that, new forms of spatial agency and spatial agents will also come out. So, when Tatiana and I were doing this, and thinking about this, and we're thinking about if the climate emergency demands new systemic changes, then what are the spatial consequences of that, and what might spatial agents do in relation to that? We did that pre-COVID. And the questions that we asked, and I could read them out, and I could put them up, were pretty sort of just out there as speculations and as provocations. And that was in January, and that, which is about 10 years ago. And they had a kind of rhetorical edge to them. But actually what I think is really interesting is how, with COVID, many of the same urgencies have actually become apparent right in front of our eyes, almost in real time. Because COVID is an ecological crisis, it's a crisis of global capitalism, and it's a crisis of the market. And therefore, if all of those things, ecological crisis of global capitalism and of the market, are relevant to COVID, they're equally relevant to the climate emergency. And therefore, the two things, and possibly the way that we react to them and respond to them, can be seen as intertwined. Now, COVID is an ecological crisis because it was brought about by the overwhelming demands of growing urban populations. It started with bats and then spread like wildfire. It's a crisis it's a global crisis in as much as the global flows of people tracking across the world spread the virus. Most obviously, University of Southampton estimated that there were 190,000 people between January and March traveling out of China from Wuhan and the other global hotspots into Europe, and 2,000 of them bringing the virus with them. But it's also, most interesting, I think, a crisis of capital, because the market simply doesn't have answers. This is so interesting, that the really dangerous speech that Boris Johnson gave, which has just been revealed in January, in which he talked about what we need to hold on to most of all is the market rather than the health of people, displayed actually he had not a clue about how to deal with it, because he had no tools in his bank to deal with COVID. And what's really interesting is how, if you go to the right-wing think tanks, they're almost silent. If you go to the Legatum, if you go to Adam Smith, if you go to the Institute of Economic Affairs, they have hardly anything to say about COVID, which is astounding given the commentaria elsewhere are just exploding in relation to it. And the reason they have is that they have no resistance to it. They have no tools. They have no free market solutions to what COVID has thrown up. And meanwhile, on the other side, or part of it actually, because they were mainly all funded by the same group of secret funders and the Koch brothers and stuff, on the other side, you have the libertarian right, who either through Trump's foot soldiers in Georgia or else on Twitter, the spike bot on Twitter, kind of playing out a really weird version of their ideas of liberty by saying, actually, the main liberty you have is to go out and get ill. And so what's really interesting is how on the one side, the think tanks that have been dominant and the economic orthodoxies that have been dominant have no resistance to what is going on. And against that, you get the progressive think tanks and the progressive thinkers who are coming out into the spotlight. So full disclosure, I am a trustee of the New Economics Foundation. But if you go to the New Economics Foundation, we are all over. They are all over COVID. Because what is clear is what COVID and the climate emergency as well magnifies and throws up are all the issues that Neff and the progressives have been talking about. Issues of the precariat, issues of out-of-control globalization, of market failure, of ecological collapse. And so suddenly, the progressives and the economists such as Ann Pettifer, Craig Rayworth, and Mariana Mazzucato suddenly are brought into the spotlight. So in Amsterdam, a group of academics and citizens and councillors are saying, we are going to use Kate Rayworth's donut economics as our model for the post-COVID world. Miata from Neff and Mariana are all over the media, just quite devastatedly picking off the failure of the market to be able to deal with it. So Mariana talking about, if we do bail these companies out, then we have to do it with some form of conditions. And those conditions are to do with equity and to do with climate justice. And so what I think COVID does has accelerated the need to look at these other forms of alternatives. And so, in just the last bit, I guess you're saying, well, what's this got to do with architecture? And where is your promised architecture after architecture? So the answer to the first question, what's it got to do with architecture, is everything, as I will try to argue. The answer to the second question, what's architecture after architecture, is, well, maybe it's 231 people sitting in a room and collectively then thinking about ways out. I don't have the solution, and I don't think anyone could have a solution, because there are no solutions. They're predicaments to try to make sense of. But I can possibly suggest some things that we need to relinquish in order to move towards architecture after architecture. First, and most painfully for a profession which is still founded on the way it looks, is to move away from notions of the aesthetic, and in particular the aestheticization of the modern project, whether it's postmodern, late modern, modern, whatever. Because that aestheticization of the modern project now actually looks kind of, at best, rather futile, at worst, rather decadent. And I thought, actually, this is kind of clear, isn't it? And this is sort of, everyone's got to agree with that. And then I did a really stupid thing, which is I Googled the aesthetics of COVID, and oh God, I cried into my screen as I saw retrofuturism and curvy surfaces and a return to kind of early modernism and cliches after cliches of the aesthetics of COVID. Anyway, we'll move on from that. So the first thing is a relinquishing of the prioritization or the kind of magnification of the aesthetic. The second, which I've already hinted at, is to try to move away from a fixation on technocratic solutions. Yes, we need to do everything we can to reduce carbon load, but this is not the only way by which we can deal with the climate emergency. And as I said before, in fact, it may be blinding us to more productive ways of dealing with the complexities. Thirdly, is to redefine what the terms progress and growth might mean within a spatial and architectural context, and to move away from the hold of neoclassical economics, which has defined progress and growth in very, very particular manners, and which we are still completely in the thaw of. And therefore, if you look at, for example, Finn Harper's God, sorry, gone for my, Smith, degrowth in Oslo, then that was an intervention which began to challenge the orthodoxies of progress and growth. And I think that the work that John Goodbone and I and Andres Wumpfhuber and Mickey Klein and others did, and Arne Matheson did on scarcity, made it, our argument is to challenge notions of progress and growth is not to move backwards. The trouble is that progress and growth are so defined as a kind of forward trajectory that you forget about other ways of looking about them. And therefore, what we argue in scarcity, the design of scarcity, is that we're looking at how you look sideways to see other ways of fulfilling human potential and desires. Now, one of the potential, not victims, but one of the potential byproducts of moving away from the aesthetics and the technical solutions and notions of progress and growth is that the focus of spatial production inevitably then has to move away from the building as the sole location by which architecture and spatial production is discussed, valued, and evaluated. And so I think that the climate emergency and the COVID crisis inevitably forces us to think about a wider scope of spatial production. Now, Tatiana Nishat and I talked about this 10 years ago in Spatial Agency, and it may be that I'm sort of now saying the time has come but that would sound a vain thing to do, because spatial agency was only a kind of articulation of what lots of other really brilliant people were already doing. But most of all, and just to end then, the optimism that I have in relation to the climate emergency and the acceleration of the issues that COVID has given to us is to do with the new social relationships which bring with them new economic relationships and cultural relationships, and how those then have spatial implications. And what we need to be thinking about and dreaming about and scenario planning about is the spatial implications of these new social, cultural and economic relationships, which COVID has absolutely accelerated and which the climate emergency also demands. So I would just list a few, okay? And these are by no means a kind of comprehensive list. But when I was putting this list together, almost every single one of them is happening in real time in my life already. Because people, because of COVID, are already having to make adjustments. So the first is of the local over the dominance of the globalized economy. Now, Neff talked about this, lots of other economists are talking about this, about how one re-describes and re-embeds economies at a local level rather than a global level. And with that goes a sense of moving away from a centralized command and control economy into a distributed economy. So a lot of the work that 00 are doing and Alice Parvin talking about this sense of both distributed economies together with the local. And then openness as a virtue. These are times in which we need openness and kindness against the increasing closing of discourse and the closure of centralized control systems. And therefore opening up, which is why I'm not saying I have the answer, but the answer is out there for open discussion. Then of communal cohesion over the social atomization of capital. What are the spatial conditions of a communal cohesion? How would we design in a world which is happening already in these streets out there? I'm not sure about Thursday at 8 o'clock, but the sense of societies coming together in a supportive and beneficial manner about social cohesion rather than the atomization of the individual, which late capitalism has promoted. Then of the valuing of people for what they do rather than for what the market determines as their worth. What does that mean in terms of the set of new forms of social and cultural relationships, which then might have spatial consequences? Of the regenerative over the extractive, that's pretty straightforward, I think. Of multiple scales of operation rather than the dominance of the bigness of the economic monoliths, i.e. being able to adjust across multiple scales, and that certainly is not happening within architecture, as the procurement processes are so moving towards a certain model of a certain scale of architecture and away from this kind of much more agile set of multi-scaled interventions, of much more agile forms of social and technical innovation versus a pretty moribund centre. The hold of the centre is pretty static. They say it's innovative, but actually most of the innovations happen around the edges. And finally, a kind of, I like the word vernacular, so I think that we need to rediscover the word vernacular in a really positive way, not against the naysayers which say it's not progressive, but the vernacular is the most progressive form of cultural production and with its spatial production away from the seductions of the desire-making machine. Now I could go on, and I think that you could fill up, each of you could fill up that list with others. But I think what's really interesting about that list is how it's happening in real time. And therefore what COVID is doing is giving us hints and clues about how we might then move out of the COVID world into a world which climate emergency is still with us. The real worry is that the post-COVID world, the right are just waiting. The reason for their silence is they see this as the greatest opportunity ever to enact the most extreme forms of disaster capitalism. So already George Osborne is saying we need to get back into austerity. Already people are saying we need to bail people out in order that the kind of the extreme forms of disaster capitalism can continue. But we've got to resist that. And we have to actually think about how in a post-COVID world, we can take some of these examples, which I said there, which are playing out in real time on our screens mainly, and how we can use them in a manner, in a much more productive and constructive, and most of all, equitable manner, which resists the tenets of disaster capitalism. And with that, and I think I will end now, what I'm really interested in then is how we exert our spatial imaginations in a manner which dreams about and constructs new narratives of how we might live together in the future in more equitable ways and ways which deal with the climate. There's an amazing book by Amitav Ghosh called The Great Derangement, in which he says, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of imagination. And what he argues is that the cultural sector have actually completely walked away from dealing with the climate emergency and got self-absorbed in a set of their own internalized discourses, whether it is the kind of self-absorption of Nausgard or the self-absorption of some architectural value systems. And what we need to do is to reawaken our spatial imaginations in a way that deals with what Ghosh calls the uncanniness of the climate emergency. And in that, I think that's where we do have hope about architecture after architecture. Thank you. You're muted, Alice.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy. That was sensational. Yeah, we're going to take some questions, and if you'd like to have the mic, then please just identify yourself in the chat box, and I will turn to you. So I think the first person we've got interest from is Carissa Turner. Chris, I'm going to unmute you now.
Oh, hi. It's a bit of a mistake. I was on CAD typing in the Pline tool.
I see.
I didn't actually mean to put anything in the chat.
Bye-bye.
So.
Then we will hear from Alicia Pivaro. Hang on, Alicia. I will... Alicia, you've got the mic.
Hello there. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jeremy. I just wanted to sort of put you on the spot and say if there are sort of 3 key actions that we can do as activists and practitioners at various scales, from local to national, political to cultural. Any suggestions?
3. Oh God, thank you, Alicia. Oh, that's not. That wasn't in the spirit of my talk. Anyway, well, you've used the word activist. I've had a huge hope seeing things like ACAN, Architects Climate Action Network, things like LETI. I mean, where is the RIBA in responding to the Part L? So Part L is being redescribed, which is the building regulations around thermal comfort and insulation. The mass house builders, also known as the Tory funders, got to the Tory party and came up with clever ways of redefining Part L, which would actually allow the house builders to reduce the amount of insulation in buildings. This amazing network of people, LETI, came together and came up with a great document. They got thousands of signatures where before there were only 14, or whatever, when in previous constitution much smaller. So my hope, this doesn't give you 3, I've given you 2 so far, LETI and ACAN, and to get political as the author. They got together and they just made a movement which left the RIBA and the big institutions just looking moribund. And therefore, I think all the action is going to come from, and ACAN, interestingly, is generally a much more youthful movement. And I think that all the action is going to come from the next generation. My hope as being, you know, head of Central St. Martin's is I just see my students both furious, but also very active. And the sense of that engagement is incredibly important to me. Sorry, Alicia, that somewhat ducked it. Do you want another one?
No, that's perfect. Get political.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. And use your intelligence. That's what Letty did. Letty used their, I forget what Letty stands for, London Environmental Transformation Initiative, I think. They used their skills and intelligence. Also, very interestingly, Letty was very, very gender balanced. And the three economists that I mentioned, there was a gender tone to those as well. And the prime ministers of the countries doing best are generally of a certain gender too. So I think there's also a gender thing going on here.
Next up, Piers Taylor. Piers, I'm going to unmute you.
Hi. I have a question really about how the local can coexist with the global, because I think I kind of feel conflicted by this need, of course, to be local, and yet at the same time concerned that in some ways that plays into the hands of this idea of a kind of small nation state post-Brexit United Kingdom. And one of my, I'm not hijacking this thread with a Brexit rant, but one of my fears about COVID is that it's playing into the hands of a post-Brexit Tory party as a convenient gift to them to be able to allow them to kind of shut down the world, keep us all super local, concerned with a sense of I am from here and you are from there. So whilst I have this sympathy towards your concern that we need to be super local, at the same time, I think it's essential that we are connected to systems and infrastructures, ideas, cultures, and people that are much bigger than ourselves, that can remove us from this claustrophobic sense of isolation in a post-Brexit, post-COVID world. So can you talk a little bit about how the local and the global can coexist in a new reimagined architecture after architecture?
Yeah, well, I think that is a real danger that you've just talked about. I wouldn't say the kind of reassertion of Little Britain is a thing to do with local. It's more to do with a sense of nationhood, of false nationhood, which we need to resist. I think that when I talk about the local, I'm more talking about forms of local democracy and local accountability and local economics, which is what Neff is talking about a kind of distributing power out from a very centralized version of power, which we've been living under politically for however long, into a more devolved set of economic and power structures, which of course will also at the same time be feeding off a much more expansive global network. But if you look at the examples, and the famous example is in Preston, in which they did a very simple thing, the three main procurers, which are the Council, the Health and University, decided that the procurement strategy would shift from the normal supply chains, which are globally oriented, into local ones, i.e. that they would only buy from local food distributors, etc., etc. And that had a transformative effect on the local economy there. So I think that I'm not talking about Little Britain, I'm not talking about the return to warm beer and the cricket pitch. I'm talking about how these more distributed forms of democracy and power and economy might manifest themselves.
Next up, Kenny Ash.
It's all my mates so far.
I thought it was really interesting, the idea that we would start refusing to use that word sustainable because we're sustaining the status quo, and that so many organizations have developed departments that speak that language, and almost, you know, insulate us from the problem or the really juicy task of getting into the scenarios where we could solve things, because it's all got to be sustained. So I think that's really good. But I'm just wondering if you had another word that would be self-explanatory. And
I know, Penny. I've been really searching for this. I mean, you use up the word resilience, which I worked on with Ezio Manzini for a bit, and I think is good, but I think has been somewhat hijacked by the right, the resilience of the economic model. And so, yeah, suggestions, please, up on the screen about how. I mean, I do think sustainability, particularly in the kind of classic definition of it, which is sort of say, we can sustain what we're doing at the same time protect the future generations, has to be rethought as a term. And it does have, just whether intentionally or not, it just has a kind of emollient and a comfort to it, which I think that we need to somehow move away from. But I don't know, has anyone else got a better idea? I'll think on it. I think it's really important. I like words and I like etymologies, and I haven't got it. Emergency is quite good. As Rebecca Sornett says about emergency, you know, it does have the word emerge in it. And out of the kind of crisis, I was going to do a quote from her, but there's something about, I don't know where it was actually. But this sort of sense of the emergency is good as well.
Andrea Citrullo.
Let's see. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, absolutely.
Great. So I've got a question. I would basically like Jeremy to develop the notion of the vernacular as a way to, I guess, avoid perpetuating the machinery of design. So I'm project curator at Teatro Mundi, and we're kind of looking at the different ways in which this kind of vernacular knowledge or smaller scale understanding of infrastructure can be used for designing and advocating for its value, which is not necessarily an economically, let's say, heterodox, discourse or what we hear.
I suppose what I'm most interested in the vernacular is, as you might guess, I'm not interested in what it looks like. I'm interested in a kind of different forms of intelligence. And what the vernacular does is to manifest a kind of sense of embodied and an emerging intelligence, as opposed to a sense of the expert coming in and intervening. And therefore, what the vernacular does for me is a sort of set up a communal table in which experts are invited to it, but they have to participate in and share other forms of knowledge and other forms of kind of vernacular intelligence. Mm-hmm. And I think that what there's a lot of, I don't know if it's vernacular intelligence, but God, just the speed that we've adjusted at University of Arts London, by using everyone's different forms of intelligence in a manner which we haven't been able to control, in order to move from, we're pretty challenged because it's a very, physical place, St Martin's UL. To move that into a virtual environment has been pretty tough. But I would say that it's been done by just gathering together all these different forms of tacit intelligence and surfacing them and bringing them out.
Yes, sometimes what we have found we've encountered is that the vernacular is sometimes so obvious, or the folk, or however you want to call it, that it's quite hard to justify it in a way that, is understood at the same level, or accepted or legitimized at the same sort of, especially if we're talking about design and different ways in which it can be done with existing materials or ideas.
Yeah, but that's because vernacular has been suppressed by the dominance of the expert and the profession claiming spatial production on their own terms. Mm-hmm. So the profession couldn't admit to the vernacular, because if it admits to the vernacular, then it admits to the fragility of its expertise. And so I think that actually reclaiming the vernacular is also a thing about trying to reconfigure what professional value systems might mean. And I'm afraid, despite the fact that Nigel Carrington, my boss, is taking over the RIBA, therefore I have to be very nice to him. I'm not sure the RIBA is the best location for that reclaiming.
Thank you.
Jeremy, there's a question from Francesca Benetti, Giannolini, who is saying, sorry, my mic doesn't work, but could you explain a bit more how capitalism is waiting for post-COVID to execute the most dramatic plan of disaster capitalism?
Oh, because of the collapse of the economy, you could take a number of different of the different approaches to the collapse of the economy. Now, at the moment, you know, the most right-wing cabinet that we've seen for years is having to resort to Keynesian intervention, which is a slight irony, but thank God they're doing it, because otherwise we'd be in real trouble. But clearly that isn't going to be sustainable, that the ideologues will seize the control again. And in that, the only way that they will argue that we can reconfigure the economy is by, and this is one of the things that Brexit does too, is by relinquishing environmental controls, taking out employment rights, getting back into a much more brutal method of employment law, etc., etc. And so the disaster capitalists, in a way, are waiting for these moments in order that they can intervene with the most extreme form of late capitalism. And I suspect there was actually something on the Adam Smith, which if you dug around, you found it, and it more or less said that. It's sort of just, this is our moment, because all the other systems of control have been so disrupted by COVID that we need just actually, and you know, Patrick Schumacher is saying it on his, he's suddenly woken up, which is interesting. He's been quite quiet, but you know, he's woken up on Twitter recently because he sees this as an opportunity for the extreme right libertarians, but he also recognises the threat of the left reasserting, horrible people like me reasserting themselves with horrible progressive ideas.
Janaja, I hope I've said your name right. I'm going to unmute you.
Yes, hi, thank you. Thank you, Jeremy, for this intervention. It's very timely. And I was thinking that you actually did mention a word, which is imagination. And recently I've been listening to an interview with Brian Eno, and he's actually been also reiterating this, and we should be also thinking out of the box to actually nurture this collective imagination that we're all sharing once we come together and you know, create this forum. And you mentioned also that new cultural, economic, and social relations will be formed, but I think also new ecological relationships will be formed. And actually, it's this like interspecies formats that we should think of how to recognize this. And maybe a way to think about creating and making would be through a prism of a planetary center design instead of like more of a human-centered. So this is something that I've been thinking of, and I would like to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Well, you sort of answered your own question, haven't you? I mean, again, if I think about where I have hope and optimism, it's actually within my job, because what a design student does, almost by definition, is to employ their imagination in order to construct new scenarios. Sometimes those scenarios are material, sometimes they're social, sometimes they're environmental, and so on and so forth. And so at St. Martin's or UAL, you've just got this endless materialization and spatialization and conceptualization of the imagination about new scenarios. And I suppose the interesting is what those scenarios now need to be, and where we need to be focusing those scenarios, as you just said, away from a kind of the modernist project of a kind of more anthropocentric form of human progress into a more collective sense of how we live together within the world. So I think you answer your questions.
Ian Page.
Hi, thanks everyone. I was just wondering about the arguments that Pierre Tamborelli put forward earlier in the week about the apolitical nature of architecture, and actually the lack of control architects have over how the program of a building develops over time. I think he was referring to how buildings are reordered in response to a prevailing political or cultural climate rather than driving those changes. So I was just wondering whether whether it was primarily a political or a spatial movement.
Well, the two are the same in my book. That anything spatial is necessarily political, in as much as anything spatial sets up a set of social relationships which have implicit within them political dimensions, whether it's spatial relationships to do with power, or spatial relationships to do with equity, or spatial relationships to do with well-being. Each of those have a political dimension. And anyone who's read the stuff I write, and I don't necessarily agree with Pierre Victoria's stuff, but my argument in terms of architecture's relinquishing of the political dimension has led to some extent to its marginalization, and therefore reclaiming the politics of space, whether it's the new spatial formations is a political act, is, I think, a necessary thing to do. Not politics in left-right, but politics as how people play their lives out in space.
William Harvey. William, are you there? Sorry. Try again. Having difficulty unmuting. Yeah, try again.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm here, yes. Yeah, I had a question, I guess, about, well, it's kind of two questions, really. And I suppose they are related in some way, but I guess first of all is due to sort of the nature of industry and the way contracts are drawn up, such as design and build contracts, it removes a lot of the power of the architect to make any decisions. Once you're novated, you're at the mercy of the contractor. And is this all a call for having new forms of contracts? And also, have you explored sort of any of that, and have any, any kind of thoughts on that? And then also, I suppose related to that is, I guess Peter Barber, I think he said, I can't remember, I'm paraphrasing now, but on his website sort of talking about what one of his essays saying that architects should just say no to some projects. And then I guess the other question that's kind of related is the sort of materials that we use in architecture, and these often having the biggest negative impact in terms of our planet, and looking forward to kind of new materials and that being part of this imagination. Discussing.
So on the contract side, yeah, I'm sure you're right, but it's not going to change the world. It might change the well-being and economy of architecture as it stands. And I see on a daily basis Sarah's and other people's frustration with the procurement process and how it's been dominated by not just a certain set of people, but by a certain set of values. And absolutely, if one could redescribe some of the methods of procurement, then I think that we would be in a better place. But I'm not sure that's going to open up to addressing some of the more radical scenarios that we need to encounter under the climate emergency. And equally with your materials, yeah, of course, we need to be looking as much as possible about the carbon load of materials, about toxicity of materials, but to a large extent, those are now not being determined by architects at all. They're being determined by contractors. So that, and insurers actually. You can't get a timber clad building insured now. You can't get CLT. insured, because the insurance market isn't going to take the so-called risk, even though CRT in Denmark is going to be used to build the biggest timber city in the world. So it's not an insurance risk. So yeah, I think you're right. The sort of the control of the system, whether it's contracts or materials or the economy of the construction industry, is not helpful. But I'm not sure it's the full solution.
Diana Cochrane. Diana, you've got the mic.
Yeah, hi there. Mine was really just a comment. I see Mariam's also followed up. It was just about, a sense of relief about the fact that, unleashing the energy and the imagination of the students to begin to suggest a more optimistic tone for the future. But just thinking, do we have the right teachers and the right institutions?
Well, I have to say yes, don't I?
Yeah, you're one of many. We're asking students to be much more political. We're asking them to be much more aware of things like economy. We're asking for education to be reformed. We need to do that pretty quickly.
I think you're right to ask the question. There's a kind of problem potentially that our students are going to move more quickly than people like me, and to keep up with them is going to be problematic. But I think that I think we all have it within ourselves to readjust our parameters, and I think we all need to do that collectively. But I think you're right to ask the question.
I think it's time for us to wrap up and let people go to dinner. But thank you so much, Jeremy. What we will endeavour to do now is unmute everybody so we can have a collective round of applause.